a plumber found an anxious man in a smock stuck at a locked Louvre door. He unscrewed the handle, let him out, and went back to work. Under the man's coat was the Mona Lisa. No alarm sounded. No one shouted. For more than a full day, nobody in the Louvre even knew she was gone. It was not until the next morning, Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 1911, that a painter named Louis Barraud walked into the salon car, carrying his easel, reached her wall, and found only 4 iron pegs and a paler rectangle where she had hung. He assumed she had been taken down to be photographed. He set up nearby and waited. Hours passed. Around noon he asked a guard to bring her back, and the guard went looking, and could not find her, and asked again, and slowly a single impossible sentence began to move through the building. The most famous face in the Louvre was missing, and no one had any idea when she had left. To understand how that was even possible, you have to understand what the Mona Lisa was in 1911. She was not yet the most famous painting on earth. She was a respected Renaissance portrait, valuable, admired by specialists, but she did not draw crowds. She hung in a crowded room among other masterpieces, and on an ordinary day a visitor might glance at her and move on. The Louvre itself was enormous, understaffed and startlingly relaxed. Hundreds of workers, cleaners, glaziers, and photographers moved through it in identical white smocks, and almost no one checked who they were. The museum closed to the public every Monday for cleaning and maintenance. It had been closed the day before, Monday the 21st. That was the day she vanished, in a building full of men in white coats, and not one of them had noticed a thing. When the police finally arrived, they shut the entire Louvre for a week and searched it end to end. What they found in a service stairwell told them exactly how it had been done, and how simple it had been. Propped against the wall was the Mona Lisa's heavy protective glass case in her frame, empty. Whoever took her had lifted the whole assembly off its 4 pegs, carried it somewhere private, and calmly separated the small poplar panel from the frame that had held it. The painting itself was barely bigger than a sheet of newspaper. It could be hidden under a coat. That detail pointed the investigation in a direction no one wanted to admit. The frame had been removed by someone who understood how it came apart. The protective glass boxes over the Louvre's treasures were new, installed only recently, and the men who had built and fitted them knew exactly how to take them off the wall. The thief was almost certainly not an outsider who had broken in. He was someone the museum had trusted, someone who had walked in as a familiar face. But the police did not chase that thread seriously, not yet. Instead, the investigation lurched sideways into farce. A tip led them to the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who had once employed a young man that boasted of stealing small statues from the Louvre. Apollinaire was arrested and thrown in prison. Under pressure, he named a friend, and so the police also hauled in a struggling Spanish painter named Pablo Picasso for questioning. Both men were terrified. Both were innocent of taking the Mona Lisa. Picasso, by some accounts, denied even knowing Apollinaire while the two of them stood in the same room. They were released, humiliated, and the painting was no closer to being found. Meanwhile, the case had become the biggest news story in the world. Newspapers ran the empty wall on their front pages. And then something strange began to happen. People started coming to the Louvre, in their thousands, specifically to stand in front of the blank space where she had been. They queued to look at 4 pegs and a rectangle of nothing. A gap on a wall was drawing bigger crowds than the painting ever had. Postcards of the missing Mona Lisa sold out. She was becoming, in her absence, the most famous woman in the world. The one piece of hard evidence pointed nowhere. On the discarded glass, investigators lifted a fingerprint. This should have been the break in the case, because France happened to be home to Alphonse Bertillon, the most celebrated criminal identification expert alive, the man who had built the police filing system used across Europe. But Bertillon's great system was organized around body measurements, not fingerprints, and the way his files worked made a single unknown thumbprint almost impossible to search. The print sat in the record, unmatched. The trail went cold. Weeks became months. Months became a year, and then 2. Officially, France began to accept that the Mona Lisa might be gone forever, perhaps already sold in secret to some private collector who would never let her be seen again. She had not left the country. She had not even left Paris. For those 2 years she lay wrapped in cloth inside a wooden trunk with a false bottom, in a cramped rented room barely a mile from the museum she had been taken from. And the man sleeping a few feet from her was exactly the person the stairwell evidence had quietly described from the beginning. His name was Vincenzo Peruggia. He was an Italian immigrant, a house painter and glazier from a village near Lake Como, one of thousands of foreign laborers doing the hard, invisible work that kept Paris running. And crucially, he had worked inside the Louvre. He had helped build and fit the very protective glass cases the museum had commissioned to guard its most valuable paintings. He knew the rooms. He knew the routines. He owned a white smock exactly like the ones the staff wore. When he walked into the museum on that closed Monday, no one looked at him twice, because on paper he belonged there. The police had actually reached him. During those 2 years, investigators worked through lists of everyone who had access to the museum's paintings, and a former glass fitter named Peruggia was on them. By several accounts, officers came to his lodging and questioned him, noted a minor prior record, accepted his answers, and crossed him off. The man being hunted across 2 continents had been standing in front of them, a mile from the empty wall, and they let him walk back to the trunk. By most accounts, he simply entered on that closed Monday morning, or possibly hid inside overnight, put on his workman's smock, and waited until the salon car was empty. Then he lifted the Mona Lisa off the wall, carried her into a nearby stairwell, and did the one job he was genuinely expert at. He took the panel out of its case and its frame, slid the bare painting under his clothing, and started for the exit. That was the moment the plumber found him at the locked door, mistook him for one more trapped workman, and let him out. Peruggia walked into the Paris morning with the most famous painting in Europe against his chest and vanished into the crowd. Then, having pulled off one of the most audacious thefts in history, he did almost nothing. He carried her back to his room, hid her in the trunk, and waited. He did not sell her. He did not flee. He seems to have had no real plan for what came next at all. And that emptiness is the strange, human center of the whole story. Why steal the most recognizable painting in Europe if you have no way to profit from it and nowhere to take it? Peruggia's own answer was patriotism. He would later insist that he had done it for Italy, that he could not bear to see a great Italian master's work hanging in a French museum, and that he meant to bring Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece home where it belonged. It was a noble story. It was also built on a mistake. Peruggia believed Napoleon's armies had looted the Mona Lisa from Italy, but Leonardo himself had carried the painting to France 4 centuries earlier and sold it to the French king. She had been in France, legally, since long before Napoleon was born. The great patriotic wrong Peruggia thought he was writing had never happened. And there is reason to doubt the patriotism was ever the whole truth, because after 2 years of silence, what finally drew Vincenzo Peruggia out of hiding was money. In late 1913, an art dealer in Florence named Alfredo Geri placed advertisements seeking artworks to buy. He received a letter signed with the name Leonardo Vincenzo from a man in Paris who claimed to have the real Mona Lisa and wanted to return her to Italy. Geri assumed it was the work of a crank. There had been countless false sightings. But cautiously he agreed to meet, and he brought reinforcement. Giovanni Poggi, the director of the Uffizi gallery, a man who would know the real painting from a fake in an instant. They met the stranger in his cheap Florence hotel room, and there, from a battered trunk with a false bottom, beneath a layer of old clothes and tools, Vincenzo Peruggia lifted out a wrapped object and set it on the bed. When they folded back the cloth, Poggi went still. The fine cracks in the surface matched. Most damning of all, on the back of the panel was the Louvre's own inventory stamp. This was not a copy. This was her. The two men kept their composure. They told Peruggia the painting would need to be examined properly to confirm it was genuine and to arrange his reward. And they carried her away to the Uffizi. Then they called the police. When the officers came for him, Peruggia seemed almost relieved, still apparently convinced he was a patriot who deserved thanks rather than handcuffs. He was not entirely wrong about how Italy would feel. When the case came to trial, much of the Italian public embraced him as a folk hero, the humble workman who had brought the great lady home. Before she was returned, the Mona Lisa was exhibited across Italy, in Florence, in Rome, in Milan, to enormous adoring crowds, a national homecoming for a painting that had legally been French for centuries. Only then, in early 1914, was she escorted back across the border to the Louvre, where the crowds waiting to greet her were larger than any she had drawn before she was stolen. Peruggia's punishment was strikingly light. Convicted of the theft, he was sentenced to just over a year, and on appeal that was cut to a little over 7 months. Having already spent time in custody awaiting trial, he was soon a free man. He served in the Italian army during the First World War, later returned to France, married, had a daughter, and lived out an ordinary life running a paint shop. He died in 1925. Remembered less as a criminal than as an oddity, the man who once walked out of the Louvre with the most famous painting in the world tucked under his coat. But the deepest twist of the story is not about Peruggia at all. It is about her. Before August 1911, the Mona Lisa was one masterpiece among many, admired but not worshipped. It was the theft that changed everything, the 2 years of front pages, the empty wall that drew pilgrims, the manhunt, the wrong men in prison, the trunk with the false bottom, the triumphant tour of Italy. The world spent 2 years unable to look at her, and by the time she came back, no one could stop looking. A house painter with a bad plan and a false belief about Napoleon had not stolen the most famous painting in the world. He had made it.